Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. This week I would like to present another layout design project, and this is one that I did some time ago and then forgot about it. It wasn't until recently I was looking through my designs that I realized I had not done a video of it. So I'm going to do that now. The site is a finished upstairs room in the client's home. It is approximately 25 feet by 13, plus this alcove in front of the window. And right from the beginning, he said that I could block the window if I needed to. The client had a lot of big city structure kits, including a 6-track passenger terminal, which he wanted to include. He wanted to run long passenger trains up to about 15 feet long. He also had a lot of bridges that he wanted to use up, including a very large double-track lift bridge. And he had 2 significant sized ship models, both in the region of about 4 feet long, that he wanted to include in a harbour area on the railroad. And another thing on his want list was a significant sized coal mine, which of course doesn't really go well with the big city modelling, so we figured that would be on a different deck. He had a 4 foot by 8 foot workbench that he had built, and he wanted it to remain in the room if at all possible, along with some display cabinets. So already that started to cut into the layout space, because there was only really a couple of places that it could go. Here is the first footprint that I drew. Basically a folded dog bone with a helix in the alcove and another one beside the door, leaving just about enough space to walk between them. And at this point the helixes are both 36-inch radius on the inside track, which is always worth shooting for when the client wants to run big steam and full-length passenger cars, even though it can be trimmed down slightly. I believe on this railroad we ended up cutting all the hidden curves down to 30 inches while keeping the 36 inches on the visible curves. Now, although this looked the most promising, and indeed turned out to be the one the client was already thinking of, I did do a little more experimentation because I always want to be sure that I'm not leaving the best option on the table. Here is a design that leaves most of the window alcove alone, the idea being that he would slide his desk in front of it and would have natural light while he was working, and would also have the whole of the west wall for his display cases. Here is another variation with the continuous loop and using the alcove for the helix. And here is a variation of that, attempting to get a peninsula down the middle so that his harbour can be viewed from both sides. Bearing in mind that he has 2 large and very detailed ship models that he wants to display, I figured this plan might have some merit. But we both agreed that the first footprint I drew was the best. Further discussion with the client revealed that the layout that he wanted seemed to have a lot in common with one that I designed a couple of years ago and which is currently under construction. Here is the main level of that other layout superimposed onto this one. It's actually a mirror image of the other design. You may recall this layout design from earlier. As this drawing shows, the space available for this railroad is somewhat longer, which is a good thing because he wants to run such long trains. We have about an extra 6 feet on the length, but the main portion of the room is a little bit narrower. The main terminal could be straight along the north wall, and we'd probably have some space available on the south side for the harbour. So it does seem that this may well be a good starting point. So with that in mind, I redrew the plan to fit in the client space. Okay, this is what I came up with. Note that the vast majority of the turnouts are not drawn in just yet. Everything's just placeholders, and this whole area around the engine terminal and the complex junction with all the double slips is just cut and pasted from the other design and placed in the appropriate location here. I've drawn the passenger terminal in the correct size for the one that he's building, and I'm hoping that the room is going to be just about wide enough to get a workable junction in this area, although that is going to be a challenge to get it to fit. And just like on the other design, it looks like there is room for some layover loops along the back, because he also particularly wanted a continuous run on the main level. And providing hidden layover loops breaks up the tail chasing effect, which would otherwise destroy any semblance of reality. And here is the lower level, showing how a good sized staging yard would fit. In order to get spare locomotive storage in the correct location, it needs to be hooked up onto the inside track, because trains will come down the inner helix, run around the loop, and then be staged facing outwards for their next trip. So all the locomotives will be at this end, And if we're going to switch locomotives, then this is where the turnout needs to be. Now at this point I was recommending a flyover with the inner helix making one additional lap. Now that does somewhat complicate the bench work, and later in the process the client told me he wasn't confident about that, so I redrew it as a flat crossing using a 30-degree diamond instead. But I will get to that later. The next thing we did was to start to work out how the harbour might look. This was the first design I did for the harbour. Now from memory, the longer, narrower ship is a destroyer, and the other one, I think he called it a freedom ship. These are the outlines of the two ships drawn to scale. Now you may notice that each of them has a short piece of track drawn down the center line. That makes it a lot easier for me to line them up, because Third Planet joins track sections together very well, but is not good at joining other things. And this represents the size of the client's double track lift bridge with the optional approach spans. And my thought for that was to have a long elevated viaduct across the city area with the port trackage running below it. My goal in laying out the harbour was to avoid having the ships in front where operators would have to reach over them to uncouple cars on the port tracks, which is why I wanted to put them away from the working areas. The client didn't like the two being separated like that. He wanted them together, either side by side or end to end. So I worked on other harbour designs. Here is one with them end to end. As I mentioned just now, I'm not keen on that idea because of the need to reach over them with the potential for causing damage. Here is another plan with them moored side by side, and it does give us half the length of the harbour without having to reach over them. And then this plan puts them both in the inner harbour, which avoids the problem altogether. And we ultimately went with a variation of this. Next, it was time to start working on the upper levels and getting those roughed in. Here is the helix that leads to the next level. We decided this would be much more open country to contrast in the entirely built up area in the city below. We'd put the mine on a short branch in front of the helix with a small yard where hopper cars would be exchanged with mainline trains. And then the main line would continue. I put this river in here as being an alternative location to use his lift bridge if we decided that it didn't work well on the harbour area below. And since I am basing this plan off the previous one that I showed you, I continued the main line with another helix in the alcove to a fourth level with what I refer to as sky staging, because that's what the other plan had. Although we do have a bonus scene here, as the main line can reappear in an area en route to the mainline staging. And since there was nothing across the end of the room on the third level, we have an opportunity to borrow that space for a deep river valley, using up another bridge. Anyway, when I sent that off, the client wrote back and said that he was not comfortable with the sky staging being above head height. So we combined these upper two levels into one. And here is the revised third level, with the upper staging yard taking the place of the helix. It does, of course, shorten the visible mainline run significantly, but the client felt that was preferable to having the sky staging above head height. Now, I mentioned earlier that we abandoned the flyover at this point and went with a 30-degree diamond crossing instead. The purpose of this drawing was just to show that arrangement and to make sure that we could get sufficient spare locomotive storage in this area. And the plan is to build the control cabinet on the end wall next to it. Now, as I've often mentioned during my layout designs, I always try to squeeze in as much staging as possible because it's something that every railroad seems to run out of. And the client was right on board with this and asked about additional staging beyond this. So I came up with a couple of different options. Here is the first option I drew. I found that a number 5 wide turnout would fit perfectly into the approaches to this locomotive yard, allowing for some more spurs inside the helix. And then another design was to try to get additional train length tracks in there, and they have to curve around the outside. I could have curved those around the front instead, but I elected to show it this way. Although after I presented him this variation, he decided that he didn't want that kind of complexity in this area. Okay, here is the previous drawing again. Shows another thing that I always do in my plans. This is the track alignment tool turned on in Third Planet, where it shows straight track in black, circular curves in red, and easements in green. And you can see from this drawing that all my mainline curves are easemented in my designs, even hidden ones, because they're just as important for smooth running as they are for appearance. So yes, if you are wondering, I do always put easements on hidden main lines as well as visible. Note that the 30-degree crossing shows up as a short section of straight in the middle of the curve. Now, since it's a very short straight, it doesn't hurt the overall operation of the train over it. Each truck will straighten up briefly as it crosses over the diamond, but each individual car and the train as a whole still sees it as a continuous curve. So after that discussion, I guess it's time to fill in the rest of the staging level. Here is the main staging yard drawn in. I found there was room for 12 tracks, most of which are plenty long enough for its longest trains. And although my intention for the scenic area was just an open piece of main line with perhaps a tall trestle over a deep valley, the client asked about adding some operation down there. I deliberately kept it minimal since this level is way too low for convenient operation, so I just included a single large industry with 3 spurs off it. Since all trains will travel through here in this direction, I made sure that it was a trailing point connection. I could have put in a run round with spurs in both directions, but I wanted to keep it minimal because, as I mentioned earlier, it's not a convenient operating height anyway. But the client wasn't happy with all the trains running through here in the same direction. He wanted to be able to run both ways. So with that in mind, I added some crossovers for him to allow that. We have a pair of crossovers at this yard throat, A and B, and another one behind the backdrop, crossover C. Now this may not look like a crossover because of its extreme length, but if I were to make it a conventional short crossover, we would lose about 4 feet of usable staging length off this inside track. So that's why I distorted it the way I did. Now crossover C basically does the same job as crossover A. So in theory you can get by without it, but it does mean then that you need to keep one of the staging tracks open for through running. So it makes sense to add all 3 of them. Anyway, now that my plan is to present 2 shorter videos per week instead of 1 longer one, I think I need to split this video into 2 parts. So before I continue with the detailed design, I am going to end this video here, and I will see you back for part 2 later in the week. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and bye for now.